What if the Bible isn't a collection of ancient, disconnected stories, but one continuous, breathtaking narrative woven together by purpose, driven by love, and alive with the voice of the Creator? What if everything from Genesis to Revelation was never meant to be read in fragments, but as a single unfolding message, where every person, every event, and every moment is part of a master plan that includes you? Today, we invite you on a journey through Scripture like you've never experienced before, not as chapters in a book, but as scenes in one divine story. If you enjoy content like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and leave a comment below to share your thoughts. Your engagement helps us reach more people with these powerful messages. Now let's begin this incredible journey with a simple but life-changing question. What if the entire Bible was one story? What if every command, every miracle, every heartbreak and promise were not random events, but connected by a golden thread that runs through all of history? What if instead of rules to follow or distant events to admire, the Bible revealed a God who has never stopped reaching out to His creation? The story doesn't begin with mankind's failure, it begins with love. It begins not with law, but with relationship. This is the framework we'll carry throughout our journey. Too often, we read the Bible like a reference manual or a collection of moral lessons. We study laws in Leviticus, songs in Psalms, parables in the Gospels, but forget to connect them. We miss the symphony while staring at the sheet music. But when we look at the Bible through the lens of one unbroken story, everything changes. We begin to see a Creator who is not distant, but deeply involved. A God who does not merely observe, but enters the narrative Himself. This grand narrative is not only historical, it's deeply personal. It's about identity, where we come from, why we're here, and what we're made for. The Bible reveals a drama of redemption, where humanity is not the hero, but the beloved. The main character is not a prophet, a king, or even a nation, it's the author himself. And through every high and low, every exile and return, his voice remains consistent. I am with you. I want you. I love you. As we begin this journey, we'll move beyond the surface of familiar stories and dive into the deeper purpose behind them. Adam and Eve are not just the first humans. They are the first glimpse into a love that gives freedom, even at great risk. The flood, the covenant with Abraham, the Exodus, these are not just acts of judgment or deliverance, but pieces of a story still unfolding. And in every moment, God's character is revealed not as a distant ruler, but as a relentless lover, pursuing what is His. If this vision of Scripture speaks to your heart, if you've ever longed to understand the Bible, not just as literature, but as living truth, then you're in the right place. We invite you to come with open eyes and an open heart. Subscribe to the channel, like the video, and leave a comment to share what resonates with you. There's so much more ahead, and this is only the beginning. Long before the stars found their place in the night sky, before the seas knew their boundaries and the mountains rose in majesty, there was something more ancient than time itself, an eternal mind, alive with purpose, desire, and vision. In this realm beyond beginnings, beyond the constraints of hours and seasons, dwelled the fullness of divine thought, where the story had already been imagined in its entirety. Every thread of the future world was already woven in the quiet chambers of a Creator who lacked nothing, yet longed to give everything. It was not necessity that prompted the dream, but love, pure, selfless, overflowing love. Before there was form, there was longing. Not the longing of lack, but the longing of abundance, the kind that seeks to share, to extend, to multiply joy by offering it. The heart of God, infinite and without flaw, envisioned a reality where freedom and connection could exist in harmony, where creation would not merely be commanded into motion, but drawn into relationship. This was the dream before time, a vision not of machinery or cold design, but of communion, a world where beauty would echo the beauty of its origin, and where beings could reflect the very love from which they were born. This is where the narrative truly begins. Not with the words, "Let there be light," but with the quiet, immeasurable silence that preceded them. A silence not empty, but pregnant with intention. The Creator imagined light not simply as illumination, but as revelation, a way to make the unseen known, to expose glory where none yet existed. The concept of light was birthed in that dream, not as a counter to darkness, but as a language. Through light, the world would speak. Through light, the Creator would be known. Within that sacred mind, before the shaping of galaxies, the design for every relationship, every tree, every heartbeat was already held in perfect clarity. The dream contained laughter, grief, choice, and redemption. It included valleys and victories, betrayals and reunions. It was never a plan born of control, but of freedom. The Creator would not script every move of His creation, but rather set into motion a story where love could only be real if it was chosen. This was the profound risk of the dream, that those formed from dust could walk away from the breath that gave them life. And still, the dream continued. Nothing had yet been spoken, but everything was already known. The Creator saw the hands that would build and the hands that would destroy, the voices that would sing and those that would curse, and chose to proceed not with hesitation, but with relentless hope. From the beginning, the story was never about perfection for its own sake. It was about love with all its cost. The dream before time held not only the joy of creation, but the pain of betrayal, the agony of the cross, and the joy of resurrection. All of it seen in one eternal moment. All of it accepted. From this eternal gaze came the decision to begin, to speak into the void and invite life into being. But even this was not rushed. The moment of creation was not the start of movement, but the continuation of purpose. It was the outward expression of what had already been decided in the secret places of the divine. The earth was not made to impress, it was made to receive. And humanity, its crown, was not shaped for obedience alone, but for belonging. The Creator did not dream of servants, but of sons and daughters, co-heirs in the story of existence. To understand this is to understand the heart behind everything that follows. The laws, the covenants, the miracles, the Messiah, they all trace back to this momentless moment where everything was imagined. Psalm 33 verse 11 tells us that the plans of the Lord stand firm forever, the purposes of His heart through all generations. Before the first tick of time, those purposes already embraced every life that would ever draw breath. You were not an afterthought. Your story was already part of the dream. In this dream before time, the Creator saw what would be and still chose to go on. Saw the rebellion and the return, the scattering and the gathering, the brokenness and the healing. The risk was always love, and love always carries risk. But it also carries the possibility of something eternal, something that, once chosen, can never be undone. The divine imagination was not naive. It was fierce, it was wide, and it was grounded in the unshakable resolve to redeem whatever might be lost. This is the story beneath the story, the whisper that gives meaning to the roar. Creation did not begin with chaos. It began with clarity. With the full knowledge of what would unfold, the Creator dreamed a world that would one day cry out for Him, and made it anyway. The universe was not crafted by accident or out of boredom, but with hands that ached to give, to share, to be known. And so, before Eden, before dust and rivers and fruit-laden trees, before commandments and kings and prophets, there was the dream. And in that dream, you were already known. You were not just foreseen, you were desired. Not as a part of a mass of humanity, but as a soul with a name, with a path, with a place. The eternal heart of God held your story in the same breath as the stars. The dream was not abstract. It was personal. In the silence that held the universe like a breath waiting to be exhaled, the Creator smiled. Everything was ready. The dream had taken form in thought, and now it would take form in word. The The story, imagined in eternity, would soon begin to unfold in time. Creation did not erupt like an explosion of power. It unfolded like a symphony composed in the secret heart of eternity, where each element was tuned with precision and care. Light broke forth not to fill a void, but to reveal wonder. Waters gathered not by coincidence, but by command, forming the canvas for life. Mountains were raised like cathedral spires, not merely for grandeur, but to echo something greater. Trees were not just placed. They were planted like memories from a dream, their roots gripping the soil as if to declare that what had begun in the invisible would now be seen. The world was not made to function, it was made to speak, to sing, to reflect the voice that called it into being. And at the center of it all, not in a palace but in a garden, a different act of creation began. Unlike the stars flung into space or the ocean summoned by command, this part of the story slowed, became quieter, more deliberate. The Creator bent low, the dust of the ground cradled in his hands, not treated as refuse, but as potential. This dust, ordinary, overlooked, unremarkable, was chosen to bear something extraordinary. The shaping was not hurried, it was not mass-produced. It was personal, meticulous. Every curve, every feature, every bone was formed not by necessity, but by design. Dust was not simply molded. It was honored. And then came the moment when silence met breath. Not just air, not mere wind, but the breath of God exhaled into what had been lifeless form. This was not biology, this was identity. In that breath was memory, intention, destiny. With it, man became more than matter, he became meaning. The breath carried with it not only animation but recognition. Adam did not simply wake up, he awakened to a world already in rhythm, already waiting for him, already echoing with the delight of his maker. This was the birth of relationship, not with rules, but with presence. Eden, lush and untouched, was not given as a test, but as a gift. A sanctuary where every leaf and every stream reminded Adam of who he was and who had formed him. This place was not about limits. It was about freedom, freedom with context, choice with purpose. Eden held no shame, no hiding, no fear. There was no need for it. Everything was as it should be. The Creator walked among the trees, not as a distant ruler, but as a friend. Every moment was a conversation, every breath a reminder. And yet the story did not stop with Adam. From his side, not from his feet to be beneath him, nor from his head to be above him, but from his rib, close to his heart, Eve was formed. Not created as an afterthought, but as a reflection of the completeness that the Creator intended for humanity. She was not made to serve, but to stand beside, to share, to walk with. And when Adam first saw her, there was no confusion, no rivalry, only awe. Bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. Not a stranger, but part of himself, and yet completely other. Together, they were the image of God, not in appearance, but in essence. Relational, creative, free. This was the breath that shaped dust, the divine choice to infuse fragility with purpose, to trust humanity with the power to choose. And in this power, love could be real, because love that cannot choose is not love at all. Adam and Eve were given everything but not owned by anything. The garden was their home, not their cage. Every tree whispered provision, every path pointed to trust. And in the middle of it all, the Creator placed a choice, not as a trap, but as an invitation. Will you trust me, even when you do not understand? What makes Eden sacred is not only its beauty, but its intimacy. Here, the divine was not hidden. God walked, spoke, delighted. The Creator was not a concept, but a companion. Psalm 8 verse 4 marvels at this very truth. What is man that you are mindful of him? The Son of Man that you care for him? This question does not come from a place of doubt, but of wonder. How could the one who holds galaxies take notice of dust? And yet he did. And not only noticed, he loved. In Eden, shame had no language. They were naked and they felt no need to hide. There were no mirrors, yet they knew who they were, not from reflection, but from relationship. Their value was not derived from effort, but from origin. Every breath they took was a reminder of the breath that had first entered them, a divine signature on their humanity. They were not gods, yet they bore His image. They were not infinite, yet they carried eternity within them. This chapter of the story is not just about a beginning, it is about intention. It shows us what was meant to be before it all unraveled. Before the distance, before the blame, before the silence, there was unity. Man with woman, creation with creator, breath with dust. And in that unity, everything was not only good, it was whole. It began with a whisper that did not belong. A voice, subtle and serpentine, slithered through the garden not with volume, but with suggestion. The tone was not forceful, not aggressive. It was familiar, almost friendly, carefully crafted to resemble concern. It asked no commands. It posed a question, just enough to cause a ripple across the still waters of certainty. Did God really say? It was not a denial of truth, it was the corrosion of trust. The lie did not need to shout. It only needed to bend the truth ever so slightly to make it feel unstable. Eve, standing within reach of everything good, found herself staring not at abundance, but at the single thing withheld. The garden, once a song of provision, now echoed with doubt. The fruit, once irrelevant in its restriction, now pulsed with possibility. And the serpent's words, slippery and slow, painted the Creator not as a giver, but as a gatekeeper. You will not surely die. You will be like God. These phrases didn't sound evil. They sounded empowering. The deception was not in the fruit itself, but in what it promised: independence wrapped in enlightenment, freedom cloaked as elevation. The power of the lie was not in what it said, but in what it implied: that God was holding something back, that perhaps the one who shaped them from dust was not entirely trustworthy. This was not simply disobedience. This was suspicion. The trust that had once been effortless now trembled. The bond formed by breath and relationship cracked under the weight of a single decision. When Eve took the fruit and gave it to Adam, the act was not rebellion in noise, it was betrayal in silence. Nothing exploded. No sky fell. Yet everything shifted. Suddenly, what had been innocent became exposed. Their eyes were opened, but not to glory, to shame. They saw their nakedness not as a mark of freedom, but as something to cover. The garden that had once felt like home now felt dangerous. Every sound became suspicion, every shadow a threat. And when the voice of the Creator echoed through the garden in the cool of the day, the response was no longer joy. It was hiding. They heard Him walking, not as a stranger, but as someone they had known. Yet they hid among the trees, not because He changed, but because they had. The question came not with anger, but with grief. Where are you? Not as a location, but as a revelation. Something had been lost, not the place relationship. The ones formed in divine likeness now trembled in fear, covering themselves with leaves that could never hide what was broken. The conversation that followed was not filled with fury, but with sorrow. Adam blamed Eve. Eve blamed the serpent. The unity that had once defined them now crumbled into blame and division. The very fabric of connection, human with divine, human with human, human with self, began to unravel. And still, the voice of God did not retreat. It pressed in. It named the consequences, yes, but also whispered the first note of redemption. To the serpent, the deceiver, came a promise cloaked in prophecy. One day, the seed of the woman would crush the head of the one who had struck the heel. The battle had begun, but the end had already been announced. In that moment, when shame wrapped around human hearts like vines, the Creator began to weave a covering not of leaves, but of sacrifice. Skins replaced the fig leaves. Blood had been spilled. Something innocent had died to cover what guilt had exposed. This chapter is not merely about a rule broken. It is about a relationship fractured. Trust, once whole, now stood fragmented. Humanity, once confident in their identity, now questioned their place. Fear entered, distance formed. The world, once in perfect balance, tilted, and yet the story did not end. The gates of Eden may have closed, guarded by flaming swords, but the heart of God did not turn cold. The voice that walked in the garden still speaks, not from a distance, but in pursuit. The psalmist would one day write in Psalm 139 verse 7, "Where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence?" Even in the earliest pages of human failure, that truth remained. Though humanity turned away, the Creator did not. Though trust was broken, love remained. And that love began to trace the first steps of a plan not for revenge, but for restoration. What was lost would be sought. What was damaged would be healed. What was deceived would one day hear the truth again. In the aftermath of the garden's exile, when echoes of intimacy had faded into the reality of toil, wandering, and fear, it might have seemed as if the story had unraveled beyond repair. The world, now fractured and stained by distrust, grew darker with each generation. Cities were built not to celebrate beauty, but to fortify pride. Violence became common language. Humanity, made for reflection of the divine, now reflected only itself, and even that dimly. But in the midst of decay, there remained a whisper, subtle, persistent, unmistakably divine. It was not the roar of condemnation, but the quiet breath of pursuit. From the ruins of Eden's harmony, the voice of God still reached out, not in fury, but in longing. The earth was full of corruption, yet it was not abandoned. Amid the noise of wickedness, one man found favor, not because he was perfect, but because he listened. Noah, alone in a world drowning in its own choices, was given a strange task: build an ark in the middle of dry land. It was not just an act of obedience, it was a symbol of hope. Every plank hammered into place was a reminder that even in judgment, salvation is being prepared. The flood, while fierce, was not the end, it was a reset. Waters that once separated land now cleansed it. The ark carried not only animals and a family, it carried the promise that the story would continue. As the rain ceased and the world slowly began to breathe again, a rainbow appeared, not as a spectacle, but as a vow: never again. The Creator, who had wept over what was broken, now declared that even the weight of judgment would be held within the arms of mercy. The covenant with Noah was not simply about preservation, it was about restoration. A reminder that even in wrath, God remembers mercy. But whispers do not remain in one place. They travel, they seek, they call. Generations later, in a land of idols and foreign gods, another voice spoke, not to a crowd, but to a man named Abram. The call was simple, yet seismic. Leave what you know, go to a place I will show you. This was not a command rooted in geography. It was an invitation to trust. Abram, whose name meant exalted father, had no children. Yet the promise given was expansive. Your descendants will outnumber the stars. The dream was alive again, now carried in the heart of one who believed, even when belief meant walking into the unknown. The journey of Abraham was not linear. It wove through deserts, doubts, delays, but the whisper never faded. It followed him through altars and famine, through silence and laughter. When the child of promise finally came, it was not just a birth, it was a prophecy in flesh. Isaac, laughter born of impossibility, was the living embodiment of the covenant. And when Abraham was asked to offer him back, it was not a test of cruelty, but a revelation. God would never ask for what he would not himself provide. The ram caught in the thicket was more than provision, it was a foreshadowing. As the lineage continued, Isaac to Jacob, Jacob to 12 sons, the whisper gained momentum. The story, once contained in a garden, now stretched across tribes and territories. Each chapter held struggle, deceit, redemption, and reunion. Yet all of it flowed toward the same thread, the covenant. God was not distant. He was weaving, moving, revealing. Jacob, who wrestled with God and limped away, changed. named the place of encounter Peniel, saying he had seen God face to face. This was not mythology, it was intimacy. Even in conflict, the voice of God was reaching, refining, restoring. Joseph, the dreamer, thrown into pits and prisons, betrayed and forgotten, became another thread in the divine narrative. Sold by his brothers, raised in a foreign land, he could have become bitter. Instead, he became a bearer of provision. When famine struck, it was not Egypt that saved Jacob's family. It was the hand of God moving through injustice to position salvation. What you meant for evil, Joseph would later say, God meant for good. This was the heartbeat of the whisper. Redemption, even in the rubble. These stories, Noah's Ark, Abraham's promise, Jacob's wrestle, Joseph's rise, are not scattered episodes. They are signals. Not merely acts of divine intervention, but evidence of divine consistency. They point to a God who does not walk away when things break, but steps into the brokenness with a plan to restore. Each act, each word, each covenant is part of something larger, something that will one day become flesh. In the ruins of trust, God built a future. In the ashes of rebellion, He whispered destiny. The story was not paused, it was being planted, and what was sown in whispers would one day be shouted from mountaintops. The covenant was not just a promise to a people, it was a declaration to the world. Redemption is coming. The story that had once moved through gardens and deserts now found itself pressed under the weight of empire. Egypt, with its towering monuments and god-kings, had become both cradle and cage for the descendants of Jacob. What began as provision in the days of Joseph had hardened into oppression. Generations passed, and the people who carried the covenant found themselves enslaved, not just physically, but spiritually. Their backs bore the marks of taskmasters, and their voices, once lifted in worship, now cried out under the sun of foreign rule. Yet even in this furnace of affliction, the divine whisper did not fall silent. It gathered strength in the hidden places, preparing to break through the silence with thunder. The children of Israel, though born in captivity, were not forgotten. The God who had called Abraham had not abandoned his lineage. When the cries of the people rose to the heavens, they were not ignored, they were remembered. And remembrance in the heart of God is never passive. It is the stirring of action, the awakening of deliverance. The answer to those cries came not through a military uprising or a political negotiation, but through a child hidden in reeds, a boy raised among royalty, yet destined to stand in defiance of it. Moses, reluctant and flawed, became the vessel of a freedom story that would ripple through time. God's approach was not hasty. He confronted Pharaoh not just with might, but with patience. The plagues were not mere punishments. They were declarations, peeling back the power of Egypt's gods and revealing them as powerless shadows. Each act struck not just at the economy of a nation, but at the very heart of its pride. And while Pharaoh's heart grew harder, God's resolve grew clearer. These people would be free. Not merely released from chains, but awakened to their true identity. Slaves no more, but sons and daughters of a promise. The night of deliverance did not come with the clamor of war, but with the hush of obedience. Blood on doorposts, the quiet faith of households who had nothing but a word to trust. The angel passed over, and death was swallowed by grace. The Exodus began not as an escape, but as a rebirth. As they walked through parted waters, walls of sea towering beside them, the people did not simply leave Egypt. They left behind an identity forged in fear. On the other side of the Red Sea, they stood not as fugitives, but as the beginning of a nation, carried not by their own strength, but by the hand of a faithful God. Yet freedom is not merely about distance from oppression. It is about the transformation of the heart. In the wilderness, where certainty was scarce and comfort non-existent, the people had to learn what it meant to be truly free. Their bodies no longer carried the chains of Egypt, but their minds still remembered the predictability of bondage. And so God met them again, not in wrath, but in guidance. At Sinai, amid fire and cloud, He spoke not merely commandments, but covenants. The 10 words, etched in stone, were not burdens, they were blueprints. Not rules to restrict, but directions to preserve freedom. Every commandment was relational. Not a list of expectations from a distant deity, but the expression of a father teaching his children how to remain whole in a world eager to fracture them again. "You shall have no other gods before me" was not jealousy, but protection. "You shall not steal, you shall not covet, you shall not bear false witness." These were not restrictions on joy, but guardrails for community. In giving the law, God was not imposing religion. He was restoring dignity. The people, once counted as property, were now partners in a covenant. Even their failures did not deter the divine commitment. When they built a golden calf and danced around it in desperation and confusion, the covenant did not shatter completely. The tablets broke, yes, but not the heart of God. He renewed what they had ruined. He revealed himself not only as mighty in deliverance, but rich in mercy, slow to anger, abounding in love. The wilderness became a classroom, the law a language of intimacy. Through manna in the morning and fire by night, the people learned to depend not on the systems of man, but on the presence of their deliverer. Freedom, as it turned out, was not about escape, it was about belonging. God was not simply forming a nation. He was shaping a people who would carry his name, not in arrogance, but in reverence. Slavery had reduced them to tools, but now they were treasured. They were called to be a light, a testimony to surrounding nations, that there was a God who rescues, who speaks, who walks among his people. And even when they grumbled, even when they longed for Egypt again, he remained. The Exodus was not only their past, it became their anthem, a song they would sing across centuries. The moment when God proved that he does not forget his promises, that he sees oppression and moves against it. This act of deliverance would echo in prophets, psalms, and prayers, and one day it would be mirrored in a far greater rescue. But for now, it stood as the declaration that the story was not over. Chains had been broken, but more than that, identities had been restored. They were no longer slaves. They were sons. The journey from desert wanderers to a nation rooted in soil was not a straight ascent, but a winding path carved through both triumph and turbulence. What had begun with liberation from Egypt now sought form and structure, a land of their own, a home not defined by movement, but by permanence. Yet in settling, the people began to hunger not just for provision, but for power, not just for the presence of God, but for a leader they could see with their eyes. They looked around and saw kingdoms with thrones, crowns, armies, and earthly rulers, and they asked to be like them. What they did not realize was that in craving a king, they were turning their gaze from the one who had always been their protector. Still, the request was granted, not because God surrendered his place, but because he would reveal through their choices what they could not yet understand. Saul, the first to wear the crown, looked the part. He was tall, commanding, impressive in every outward measure, but his heart was fractured by fear and self-preservation. Leadership without intimacy with God quickly became corrosion. It was not the enemies outside that undermined Saul's reign. It was the erosion within. And as the kingdom faltered under the weight of his disobedience, a new whisper began to stir in the fields of Bethlehem. David, the youngest son, overlooked by men but chosen by God, entered the story not with armor or politics, but with a slingshot and songs. A shepherd with a warrior's courage and a poet's heart. His rise to kingship was not immediate. It was forged in caves, in conflict, in years of hiding and waiting. Yet through it all, David's heart remained tethered to something greater than the throne. He danced before the ark, wept over his failures, cried out for mercy, and clung to God's presence with desperate longing. He was not flawless, far from it, but his repentance was real. He did not mask his brokenness. He brought it into the light. His psalms became the language of generations, songs that still cry out from hearts seeking the same intimacy. Psalm 51 verse 10 pleads, "Create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a right spirit within me." That cry did not end with David, it echoed forward. When Solomon inherited the crown, the kingdom reached its pinnacle of glory. Wisdom flowed from his lips like rivers. Kings and queens came from distant lands to marvel at what had been built. The temple stood in splendor, gold gleaming, rituals echoing with reverence. And yet, somewhere within the chambers of luxury, the seeds of compromise took root. Foreign alliances brought foreign gods. The heart that had once asked for wisdom now divided its allegiance. What had been unified began to fracture. And after Solomon, the kingdom split, not just geographically, but spiritually. Israel and Judah stood as mirror images of potential and disappointment. Some kings followed the path of righteousness, many did not. Idolatry rose like smoke from the high places. Injustice crept through city gates, and the people, once set apart, now mirrored the very nations they were called to reflect light into. But even in this unraveling, the voice of God did not withdraw. It grew louder, more urgent. Prophets emerged, not as celebrities, but as mouthpieces of truth in a time of confusion. Isaiah spoke of a child to be born, a prince of peace, a suffering servant. Jeremiah wept over Jerusalem, lamenting a people who had lost their way. Ezekiel saw visions that bent the imagination, reminding the exiled that the Spirit still moved, even by foreign rivers. Hosea lived out heartbreak to mirror God's covenant love for a faithless bride. These voices were not merely warnings, they were windows. Through them, the heart of God bled onto the pages of history. "Return to me, and I will restore you." Exile came not as a random tragedy, but as consequence. The people who had longed for a kingdom had forgotten its king. Babylonian chains replaced Egyptian ones. And once again, the people found themselves longing not just for land, but for home. Not just for freedom, but for redemption. The temple was destroyed, the city burned, the ark no longer in view. Yet even in captivity, the promise endured. Daniel, refusing to bow, prayed toward the ruins with hope. Esther, risking her life, preserved a people through courage. These were not the final chapters, they were the smoldering embers of something waiting to ignite again. The longing had shifted. No longer was it simply for national pride or political strength. It had become deeper, more personal. The prophets pointed not to another man of war, but to a different kind of king. One who would not only restore Israel, but redeem humanity. The cry of the people began to focus, sharpen, ache. They were not just asking for justice. They were yearning for Emmanuel, God with us. This longing, shaped through centuries of both glory and ruin, had prepared a people for more than restoration. It had prepared them for revelation. The throne of David had become more than a seat. It had become a symbol. The voice of the prophets, once marginalized, now echoed in every heart that still believed the story was not yet finished. Not every movement in the story comes with fire or thunder. Some chapters unfold not through noise, but through stillness. And when the final words of the prophets had been spoken, when the last scroll had been set down, a great hush settled over the people of God. 4 centuries passed with no new visions, no divine messengers, no fresh revelation. It would have been easy to mistake that silence for abandonment, to imagine that the voice which once split seas and summoned stars had faded into distance. But silence, in the hands of the eternal, is never empty. It is often the prelude to something deeper. These 400 years, though quiet in scripture, were not hollow in history. Kingdoms rose and fell like waves against the shore. Persian rule gave way to Greek influence, and Greek eventually bowed to Rome. Languages shifted, cultures collided, roads stretched farther than they ever had before. The world was being restructured, borders redrawn, empires consolidated. But underneath the politics and power, something subtler was taking place: preparation. In this silence, the hearts of people did not stop searching. In synagogues scattered across the Mediterranean, the scriptures were read and reread, rituals preserved, prayers offered. The longing for deliverance did not die, it deepened. The promise of a Messiah, whispered by prophets like Isaiah and Micah, became the anchor in the storm of foreign rule. Every Sabbath reading, every festival observed, carried with it an ache, a hope, a question: when will he come? During this time, movements rose from within the Jewish people, each trying to define what faithfulness looked like in the face of silence. The Pharisees clung to purity and tradition, guarding the law as if it were a fragile flame. The Sadducees aligned themselves with power, navigating survival under Roman rule. The Essenes withdrew, searching for holiness in the isolation of the desert. And the Zealots sharpened their swords, imagining revolution would bring redemption. Each group, in its own way, reflected a response to divine silence. But none could fill the void. The voice they longed for was not just truth, it was presence. And yet, amid these human efforts, God was not still. He was aligning time, arranging geography, synchronizing culture. Roads built by Rome would soon carry messengers of a different kingdom. Greek, spoken across regions, would soon become the language of letters that would change the world. A census, decreed for reasons of bureaucracy, would bring a young couple to a forgotten town where prophecy would be fulfilled without fanfare. Nothing was wasted. The silence was pregnant with purpose. This was not the first time silence had preceded a divine move. Before the flood, before Abraham's call, before the Exodus, there had been waiting. The rhythm of redemption often begins in stillness. Like seeds buried beneath winter soil, the promises of God germinate in places where nothing seems to move. And yet, at just the right moment, they break through. Galatians 4 verse 4 would one day capture this truth. When the fullness of time had come, God sent his Son. Not a moment early, not a moment late. The silence had been the tuning of instruments before the song. And in that long hush, the ache of humanity intensified. People grew weary not only of oppression, but of pretending they could save themselves. The world, with all its structures and philosophies, offered no true rescue. The hunger was not for a teacher, not for a warrior, not even for a king, but for something entirely new. Something that could speak into the silence with a voice that made the heart remember. The prophets had spoken of a light, of a servant, of a child. Their words lingered like echoes in the hearts of those who waited. They did not have the luxury of certainty, but they held on with faith. The silence did not break them, it refined them. Every unanswered prayer became part of a larger tapestry, woven not by human hands, but by divine intention. The yearning was not a flaw, it was part of the design. When the silence would finally break, it would not be with a trumpet or an earthquake, but with the cry of a newborn. Not in a palace, but in a stable. Not with proclamation, but with incarnation. But before that moment, there had to be space. And that space was filled with waiting, not passive resignation, but active hope. This chapter in the story is often overlooked, yet it carries weight. It reminds us that God does not measure time as we do. That his pauses are not indicators of absence, but of orchestration. That even in the quiet, he is working. That faith is not only about believing when we hear, but about holding on when we do not. The silence, then, was not an end, it was a breath. And the next word would change everything. When silence finally broke, it did not announce itself with military procession or celestial spectacle. It entered quietly, through labor pains in a back room of an overcrowded town, beneath the gaze of livestock and lanterns. Bethlehem, small and unnoticed by kings and councils, became the birthplace of a new kind of kingdom. The moment had arrived, not with the clamor of human ambition, but through the breath of an infant. And in that fragile cry, eternity entered time. God did not descend with fanfare. He did not choose a throne or a temple or a warrior's body. Instead, he chose a womb. He chose hunger, weakness, and the slow rhythm of human growth. He who had spoken galaxies into being now relied on the steady heartbeat of a young woman to sustain his life. He who had measured oceans in the hollow of his hand now clenched tiny fingers around a mother's thumb. Love, vast and uncontainable, chose to wear skin. The incarnation of Jesus was not just divine strategy, it was divine surrender. Not the loss of divinity, but its concealment beneath layers of humanity. The one who had been worshipped in glory now needed to be burped, fed, carried. God as an infant did not stop being infinite, but he accepted the limitation of flesh to walk among those who had long forgotten what it meant to be fully alive. This was not myth, it was mystery, God with us, not above us. Not a visitation from the divine, but a habitation. John's Gospel would later declare in its opening words that the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. Not visited, not observed, but lived with, tented among us as if to echo the wilderness tabernacle. Jesus was the true sanctuary, the walking presence, the living reminder that the divine had not forsaken humanity, it had joined it. The manger, often softened by sentimentality, was in truth a scandal. That the Almighty would be born not only poor, but vulnerable. That angels would sing to shepherds, the lowest of society, before anyone else. That magi from distant lands would recognize what priests in Jerusalem overlooked. From the very beginning, this birth flipped the expectations of what salvation would look like. It did not climb upward, it stooped downward. It did not dominate, it embraced. As Jesus grew, his life never strayed from this pattern. He touched the untouchable, spoke with the outcast, wept with the grieving. He did not hide his emotions behind divinity. He revealed the Father through them. Every step he took across Galilean roads was a step of identification. He knew fatigue. He knew temptation. He knew rejection and betrayal. And yet, at every turn, he redefined power through compassion and truth through presence. He did not argue love, he embodied it. Children ran to him without fear. The poor found dignity in his eyes. Women, often silenced and dismissed, found their voice in his presence. The sick were not only healed, they were seen. The hungry were not merely fed, they were welcomed. And sinners, those society had condemned, were invited to sit at his table, not as guests needing to prove their worth, but as family returning home. Jesus taught, yes, but even his teachings were acts of incarnation. His parables took the eternal and wrapped it in the language of fields, coins, weddings, sheep. He did not speak from a mountain of abstraction, but from the soil everyday life. Through him, the divine became understandable, not because it was diminished, but because it was made present. Love had a face. Grace had hands. Mercy had footsteps. His very presence was confrontation, not of wrath, but of invitation. Those who wanted a Messiah of sorts found in him a servant with a towel. Those who wanted vengeance saw in him forgiveness extended without limit. And those who had built their power on religion and control saw in him a threat, not because he broke the law, but because he fulfilled it in a way they could not grasp. Psalm 85 verse 10 would come alive in him. Mercy and truth are met together. Righteousness and peace have kissed each other. These were no longer poetic abstractions. They were lived realities. In Jesus, the tension between justice and love found resolution, not through compromise, but through incarnation. Yet the marvel of this chapter in the story is not only in how Jesus lived, but in who he revealed. To see him was to see the Father, not a filtered version, but the full image. Every word, every gesture, every act of compassion was a window into the heart of God. He did not simply represent God, he was God among us. And in this, the world was no longer left to wonder what divinity looked like. It had walked in our dust. Love, in its truest form, had never looked like this before. It did not demand, it gave. It did not remain distant, it came close. It did not shield itself from pain, it entered into it willingly. The incarnation was not just the beginning of Jesus' story, it was the center of ours. For in his coming, the long silence was not only broken, it was answered. The crowds did not know what to make of him. Some whispered Messiah, others muttered blasphemer. He healed with a touch, taught with authority that pierced centuries of tradition, and walked through towns and villages like a man on a mission no one fully understood. He spoke in riddles and stories, not to confuse but to awaken. He dined with the wrong people, touched the wrong bodies, broke the wrong rules. And still, something in him pulled the broken near and pushed the powerful into discomfort. Jesus, the carpenter's son, carried a kingdom in his voice, and yet wore no crown, no armor, no insignia of rule. He was a king, but not the kind they expected. This was a kingdom without borders or armies, one where the first were last and the poor were called blessed. It was not announced by decree, but by action. Sight restored to the blind, skin made whole, legs strengthened, death reversed, storms calmed. Yet he often told those he healed to tell no one, as though the miracle was not the point. The point was the person, the relationship, the heart. Power in his hands, but humility in his steps. The more he revealed, the more tension thickened. His presence became a dividing line. The religious leaders, steeped in law and structure, found themselves undone by his words, not because he rejected the law, but because he fulfilled it in ways they could not control. He exposed their performative righteousness, not to shame them, but to invite them into something deeper. They clung to titles, he washed feet. They exalted tradition, he pointed to truth. They used religion to build distance, he used love to close it. And the people, oh the people, flocked to him, not just for what he did, but for how he made them feel seen. Women caught in sin, men who collected taxes for an empire that hated them, children often pushed aside by importance, all found a place at his side. He redefined value, not by status, but by the simple dignity of being created and beloved. His miracles were not spectacles. They were signs, not just of power, but of character. Yet with every step, it became clearer. He was heading toward something. There was an urgency, not frantic, but determined. The closer he came to Jerusalem, the more the tension rose. He spoke of death, not as defeat, but as destiny. He told his disciples he would suffer, that he would be handed over. They could not grasp it. A Messiah who dies? That was not the story they had been waiting for. They envisioned revolution. He kept speaking of redemption. When he entered the city, the crowds shouted Hosanna, laying palm branches before him as if to crown him. But he wept. Not because he feared what was coming, but because he saw what they did not understand. Their cheers were short-lived. Their hopes, tied to conquest, would soon unravel into cries of crucify. In the upper room, on the night before it all changed, he took bread and broke it, took wine and poured it, and said, "These are my body and my blood." Not to confuse, but to prepare. The king was giving himself away. He knelt with a towel, washed their feet, and spoke of love as commandment, of unity as testimony. He prayed for them, not to escape the world, but to be kept in it, sent into it with the same love that had sent him. The garden was not just a place of prayer, it was a battlefield of surrender. While his friends slept, he agonized. Not over pain, but over the cup he would drink. He did not resist the cross, he accepted it. And when the betrayal came, with a kiss and torches, he did not run. He stepped forward. The trials were a mockery, the justice twisted. False witnesses, political games, and the quiet complicity of power. Pilate, staring into truth itself, asked what is truth, and then turned away. The crowd, swayed by fear and influence, chose a criminal over the Christ. And the soldiers, numb from routine, led him to the place of execution. The king was stripped, mocked, crowned with thorns. The hands that had healed were pierced. The feet that had walked toward the broken were nailed to wood. And above him, the sign, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. What they meant in irony, heaven received his coronation. This was not the end of a teacher's life, it was the fulfillment of love's greatest vow. On that cross, justice and mercy collided. Not balanced, but embraced. Sin was not ignored, it was carried. Shame was not dismissed, it was borne. Wrath was not withheld, it was absorbed. And in his final breath, he did not curse, he forgave. He entrusted, he completed. It is finished was not surrender to death, but the declaration that nothing more was required. The earth shook, the veil tore, and the sky darkened, as if creation itself responded to what had taken place. The king had given everything, not to demand loyalty, but to offer reconciliation. It began before the sun had fully risen, when the weight of grief still hung in the air like morning mist, and the world lay silent under the shadow of death. Those who had followed him, those who had believed, were shattered, scattered in their sorrow. The cross had crushed more than a body, it had crushed hope. What was supposed to be a revolution of healing had ended in public humiliation. The tomb was not just a burial site. It was the ceiling of shattered expectations. But what no one saw coming, what no heart dared to imagine, was that within that sealed stone, death itself had begun to unravel. The resurrection did not come with parades or royal proclamations. It began quietly, like a whisper that builds into a song. Women approached the tomb at dawn, carrying spices to honor a corpse, not realizing they were walking toward a miracle. They expected stillness, but they found disruption. The stone, that final symbol of closure, had been rolled away not to let Jesus out, but to let them in. Inside, the tomb was empty, but their hearts began to fill. Angels did not explain with long sermons. They asked a question that echoed through time. Why do you look for the living among the dead? He is not here, he has risen. That sentence shattered centuries of fear in one breath. Death had met a force it could not hold. The resurrection was not reversal, it was revolution. It did not erase the crucifixion, it completed it. The grave was no longer a destination but a doorway. Jesus appeared, not first in thrones or temples, but in gardens and quiet roads. To Mary, weeping outside the tomb, he spoke one word, her name. To two men walking in confusion toward Emmaus, he joined them in their journey, not revealing his identity until the breaking of bread. To Thomas, still wrapped in doubt, he offered wounds, not rebuke. Each encounter was personal, deliberate, full of grace. The risen Christ did not come to boast. He came to restore. This was not resurrection as legend, not symbolic triumph, but embodied reality. He walked, he ate, he taught. And yet, something had shifted. He no longer belonged to death's timeline. He passed through locked doors, not as a ghost, but as a transformed man. The scars remained, not as reminders of pain, but as proof of love. What once signified defeat now testified to victory. In rising, Jesus dismantled the final power of death. He did not simply return to life as it was. He inaugurated life as it would be. The resurrection was not only about him, it was about us. Humanity's exile had found its bridge. The curtain torn in the temple was now joined by a stone rolled from a tomb. Access was no longer barred. The Father's arms were open again. The apostles, who had once scattered in fear, now became fearless. Something had changed, not just around them, but within them. The same Peter who denied now declared. The same John who fled now wrote of life and light with fire in his bones. They did not proclaim a memory. They proclaimed a living king. And their message was simple, but seismic. He is alive, and because he lives, so shall we. Death was no longer the full stop at the end of the sentence. It had become a comma, a transition, a passage into something richer. The resurrection rewrote not just theology but destiny. It redefined justice as mercy fulfilled. It recast history as his story. And it extended a new identity to all who would believe, not just as forgiven sinners, but as co-heirs with Christ, partakers in resurrection life. Paul would later write in 1 Corinthians 15 that if Christ has not been raised, our faith is in vain. But he did rise, and therefore nothing remains the same. The cross may have revealed love, but the resurrection proved it. It validated every word, every promise, every prophecy. It took the agony of Friday and the silence of Saturday and birthed a new dawn on Sunday that would never fade. This is why we celebrate, not just an event, but an invitation. The empty tomb is not just a signpost in history, it is a summons to live no longer enslaved by fear, to hope no longer tethered to circumstances, to walk not toward death, but through it into the arms of a resurrected King who has tasted every part of our story and rewritten the ending. What happened that day outside Jerusalem was not the revival of a life, it was the undoing of death. It was the declaration that despair does not get the final word, that graves do not hold what God has redeemed. The stone was rolled away, not just from the tomb, but from the hearts of humanity. Death died that day, and life, true life, began. The city was alive with celebration, filled with pilgrims from every corner of the known world. Languages mingled in the streets, cultures brushed against one another like flowing robes in a crowded marketplace. It was Pentecost, the feast that commemorated the giving of the law at Sinai, when fire once descended upon a mountain and a nation was born. But on this particular morning, the fire would fall again, not on stone tablets or mountain peaks, but upon hearts, upon breath, upon flesh. And the law once written externally would now be etched within. The disciples waited in an upper room, not with strategy, but with obedience. They had seen the risen Christ, watched him ascend into clouds, heard the promise that power would come. But they did not yet understand what that meant. They were fishermen, tax collectors, former zealots, ordinary people made extraordinary only by their willingness to follow. In those days of waiting, there was prayer, there was unity, there was expectancy. And then, without warning, sound filled the silence. Not a whisper or a song, but a rushing wind, as if heaven itself had exhaled into the room. What followed defied imagination. Tongues of fire appeared, not destructive, but illuminating, resting on each one. And suddenly, their mouths opened not in confusion, but in clarity. Languages they had never learned poured forth. Words understood not only by ear, but by spirit. The same spirit that had hovered over the waters at creation, that had descended like a dove at Jesus' baptism, now took residence within them. This was not visitation. It was habitation. The transformation was immediate. The same Peter who once trembled before a servant girl now stood before the multitudes and proclaimed with unshakable conviction that Jesus, the one crucified, had risen and was both Lord and Christ. His words cut through centuries of expectation and fear, not because they were polished, but because they were anointed. 3,000 hearts were pierced, not by argument, but by truth ignited by the Spirit. What began as a moment became a movement. The church was not born from committee or cathedral, but from fire, divine, unpredictable, and alive. The Spirit did not make them louder for the sake of noise, but bolder for the sake of the message. And that message was not theory or tradition, it was a person. It was presence. It was power wrapped in love. The believers became more than followers. They became witnesses, not just of what Jesus had done, but of what he was still doing through them. The Spirit moved not just through miracles, but through community. They shared their possessions. They broke bread with glad hearts. They gathered in homes not as institutions, but as families. The world around them saw not just doctrine, but devotion. Not just theology, but transformation. Barriers began to fall. Jews and Gentiles, men and women, rich and poor. The divisions that had once marked society now dissolved in the fire of unity. The Spirit did not erase individuality, it wove it into harmony. Each person became a vessel, not identical, but indispensable. Gifts poured out, not for personal gain, but for the strengthening of the whole. Prophecy, teaching, healing, mercy, all expressions of the same Spirit, alive in different forms. But this fire was not tame. It confronted corruption. It exposed lies. It refused to coexist with pretense. Ananias and Sapphira learned that holiness was not negotiable. Simon the sorcerer discovered that power could not be purchased. The Spirit could not be manipulated. It moved with purpose. It moved with purity. Persecution followed, but so did multiplication. The more the church was pressed, the more it expanded. Prisons could not contain the message. Threats could not silence the song. Martyrs died, but the flame spread. Stephen saw heaven open as stones fell upon him. Philip preached to strangers on desert roads. Peter spoke to centurions who had never set foot in a synagogue. The gospel leapt across cultures, languages, continents, not by force, but by fire. This chapter of the story is not merely historical. It is foundational. Pentecost was not the end of Jesus' ministry, it was its expansion. What he had done in Galilee and Jerusalem was now being echoed in Antioch, in Corinth, in Rome. And wherever the Spirit moved, life erupted. Brokenness mended. Division healed. Hope ignited. The fire that fell was not only a moment, it was a mission. And it continues still, not confined to pages or pulpits, but alive in the hearts of all who believe. For the same Spirit that hovered, descended, and ignited is still breathing, still calling, still empowering. In the aftermath of fire and transformation, as the church stretched its limbs across cities and cultures, it did not remain untouched by strain. Growth, while glorious, is not without pain. The early believers, though filled with the Spirit, still carried the weight of their humanity. They had tasted heaven, but their feet remained planted on uncertain soil. Conflicts arose. Questions multiplied. Old ways wrestled with new life. And into this fragile, beautiful, and often fractured body, letters began to arrive not with cold instruction, but with the warmth of divine concern. These epistles, written by apostles who had walked with Jesus, or who had encountered him in blinding revelation, were not sterile documents of theological debate. They were personal, passionate, and profoundly pastoral. Paul, Peter, James, John, Jude, men who knew both glory and suffering, poured ink onto parchment with urgency and tenderness. They were not writing to perfect people. They were writing to a bride still learning how to walk, still learning how to love, still learning who she was. The churches they addressed were as diverse as the lands they occupied. Corinth, a city of culture and corruption, struggled to separate spirit from spectacle. Galatia, eager and earnest, began to trade freedom for law. Ephesus shone with insight, but needed to remember its first love. Philippi clung to joy in the midst of persecution. Rome, the seat of empire, wrestled with unity amid division. And in all these places, believers gathered, some in homes, some in hiding, all holding fast to a hope that had changed everything. The letters did more than correct, they comforted. They reminded these early communities that grace was not a one-time gift, it was a continual covering. Paul, who once hunted the very people he now shepherded, understood this better than most. He called himself the least of the apostles, yet his voice became the melody of the new covenant. To the Corinthians, he wrote of love that bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things, not as sentiment, but as a rebuke to selfishness. To the Galatians, he pleaded, "Do not return to bondage." Freedom had come, and it was too precious to lose. These epistles were not theoretical. They were born from prison cells, from long journeys, from shipwrecks and beatings, from the daily grind of caring for souls. They addressed gossip, greed, idolatry, immorality, not to shame, but to heal. They called the church to holiness, not as moral superiority, but as reflection of the one who had redeemed them. Be imitators of Christ was not a slogan, it was a summons. James wrote of faith that works, insisting that belief without action was as lifeless as a body without breath. Peter urged endurance through suffering, pointing to a glory that suffering could not diminish. John returned again and again to love, not as abstract theology, but as the very nature of God made visible. He who does not love does not know God, This was not a suggestion. It was a mirror. The church was not always strong. It fractured over doctrine. It stumbled into favoritism. It hesitated in the face of persecution, and yet it endured. Not because of its wisdom, or structure, or numbers, but because Christ had promised that the gates of hell would not prevail against it. The letters became part of that endurance, holding the community together with reminders of truth, with clarity when the path grew dim. Paul's words to the Romans carried a weight that still echoes. Neither death nor life, neither angels nor demons, neither the present nor the future, nor any powers, will be able to separate us from the love of God. That was not poetic optimism. It was the cornerstone of their survival. Grace was not a doctrine. It was breath. And where sin increased, grace increased all the more. But the letters also looked forward. They did not merely patch wounds, they prepared the bride. Christ is coming again. Be ready, stay awake, keep the faith. Their pages held not only correction and counsel, but anticipation. The church, though flawed, was being refined. Through hardship, through discipline, through love. And one day, she would stand radiant, having been made holy not by her own effort, but by the blood of her bridegroom. These letters, now bound in our Bibles, were never meant to be static. They still speak, still breathe, still pierce and comfort. They are reminders that we too are that bride, still growing, still stumbling, still beloved. And the same grace that carried the early church carries us still. History has a way of drawing lines, placing beginnings and ends, treating events like destinations. But Scripture never finishes the story that way. Revelation, the final chapter of the Bible, does not close the book. It reopens eternity. It peels back the veil between now and forever, not to confuse but to comfort. And in its vivid symbols and striking visions, something becomes unmistakably clear. The one who walked among us, who died and rose, is not only returning, he is restoring. This vision was given not in ease, but in exile. John, old and isolated on the island of Patmos, was not retired. He was still watching, still listening. And what he saw was not a flickering future, but a blazing reality. Thrones, judgments, scrolls, beasts, all carry weight, but they orbit around a single certainty. Jesus is king, not only in heaven, but over history. He is not returning to compete for the throne. He already holds it. The vision begins not with wrath, but with worship. Angels, elders, and living creatures surround the throne, crying, "Holy, holy," not because they are programmed to repeat it, but because every moment in His presence reveals something new, something worthy. And in the midst of all that majesty stands a lamb slain, yet alive, because in this kingdom, victory looks like sacrifice. The letters to the 7 churches are not nostalgia, they are diagnosis and hope. They remind the bride of her calling, her purity, her purpose. They call out compromise, yes, but always with the heart of a groom longing for his beloved to return. Each message ends with a promise to those who overcome. The victory is not just in surviving, but in staying faithful. Then come the seals and trumpets and bowls, a cascade of justice and mercy, not to terrify, but to testify that evil will not have the final word. Babylon, the city of pride and oppression, falls. The dragon, the beast, the false prophet, all defeated. But more than what ends, Revelation is about what begins. A new heaven and a new earth. Not a disembodied paradise, but a restored creation. The holy city descends like a bride adorned for her husband. No more tears, no more death, no more night. The curse, spoken in Eden, is lifted forever. The tree of life, once guarded by angels, now grows freely along a river that flows from the throne. This is not fantasy. This is fulfillment. And at the center of it all, God with His people. Not through priests or prophets or even apostles, but face to face. The dwelling place of God is with man. The story that began in a garden ends in a city filled with light, and yet it feels like a return. Eden, reborn and unbreakable. What was once lost is now forever secure. The book closes with an invitation. Come. Let the one who hears say come. Let the one who is thirsty come. Let the one who desires take the water of life freely. This is not a conclusion, it is a call. The Spirit and the bride say come, because the story continues with every heart that responds. Jesus' final words are not warnings, they are promises. Behold, I am coming soon. And the cry of the church across every generation, every language, every nation, echoes back. Come, Lord Jesus. This is the story, from dust to glory, from exile to home, from silence to song. And it's not just a story we read, it's a story we're part of. The pages may be complete, but the invitation remains open. Thank you for being part of this journey through the entire Bible as one unified story. If this message touched you, inspired you, or helped you see Scripture in a new light, please consider subscribing to the channel so you don't miss future videos. Like this video to let us know it mattered to you. Leave a comment, we'd love to hear what part of the story impacted you most. And above all, share this video with someone you love. You never know who needs to hear this story today.